Hello, everyone. Welcome to Conversation of Power. In another episode, I'm your host, Lokman Karadag, with you, with my guest, Georgi. Today, we are going to discuss Bangsamoro region, which is one of the, I think, strategically most important location. We can say that. And as many of you know nowadays, how the supply chains, the ports, the choke points became almost a core point of international relations. Many great powers, regional powers, they are strongly interested and heavily focused on this geopolitical part of the world. We will look at and zoom out the importance of Mindanao Bangsamoro region, how these regions survive through its historical relations with neighboring countries and with the Filipinos. We will try to unpack all these details of this strategically geopolitical region just next to the Malaysia, Indonesia, the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea. Strategically is a really very important location. I'm joining today by Georgi Engelbrecht. Georgi spent a lot of years in Philippines. He's joining crisis group in late September 2019 as a senior analyst for Philippines. He focuses mostly on the various conflicts and peace process within the country. In addition, he carries out research and analysis of topics relevant to the Philippines neighborhood, such as the South China Sea or the Sulu Sea. George worked for around 8 years on the southern Philippines, mostly on conflict prevention and civilian protection. He was part of the international monitoring team in Mindanao until 2019, and he has master's degrees in international law and international relations. Hi, Georgie. Thank you for joining me today from Manila.
Hi Lokman, hi to Turkey, marhaba.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Georgie. And I want to start with the historical background of Mindanao or Bangsamoro region. Historical consensus or the sources identifies the 1968 Jabida, we can say massacre, as the immediate flashpoint for the armed struggle in the region. But looking deeper at the demographic shifts since the American colonial period, do you think that the resistance primarily driven by the massacre itself or by the systemic state-sponsored migration of the settlers from the north to the turning Moro people into a minority in their own ancestral homelands?
Well, thank you for this. I think, as with many questions about history, it's a very complex issue, and I think you have deep-seated structural factors as well as key episodes and moments that really put the situation more in the spotlight and really contributed and accelerated history. So I think even before 68 and the beginning of the 20th century, we had the long history of colonialism and the efforts of um, the Spanish and then later the Americans to basically control the island territory that is now known as the Philippines. And the indigenous residents of Mindanao, some of whom, or the majority of whom, later took up Islam as a religion, obviously resisted the Spaniards for many centuries of years. I think there has been an American historian who wrote a book about the moral struggle. He was saying that, as fighting men, the Moros take the first rank in the pages of martial history. So it already tells you that before the organized violence of the 60s, you had a long tradition of resistance to foreign invaders and the claim to self-determination, rooted in the fact that the various Moro entities and sultanates and organizations were already present before Magellan and Legazpi came in and tried to, conquer the Philippines. Now, of course, the demographic shifts in the beginning of the 20th century were very much essential. But I think if you look at the 40s and the 50s, where the balance was not yet fully skewed, you still have a cautious coexistence between Christian and Moro leaders as well as communities. I think we've observed in the 60s a slow and steady rise in political violence between politicians and actors we would commonly call warlords, that also coincided with more and more violence in and between communities and massacres against the Moro people. So Jabida was just one, but even now, with the peace process happening, transitional justice is still a key term, which means that, you know, the Moro people are trying to convey to the rest of the Philippines that they've been, part of a campaign of injustices that actually took part before the conflict. And I think if you look at what happened on the bigger picture, we have the policy of the Philippines to transport Christians from the north to the south, but you also have communal conflicts over land in parts of Mindanao. You have many towns now that are majority Christian, but that used to be Moro Muslim or under Moro Muslim influence. And I think from 1968, between Jabida and 1972, the onset of martial law, you have had this incubation period where community frustrations and conflicts basically culminated in organized rebel movements. And here we have the Moro National Liberation Front, that was the strongest one, the one that tried to unite various self defense militias, and that basically carried the struggle against the Marcos government.
And Moro Nation Liberation Front is a secular and nationalist, am I right, movement?
Relatively speaking, yes. And it's interesting if you go back in time and you look at, for example, nicknames of the MNLF, some people were calling them actually Maoists because of the heyday of course, Third World ideology, the importance of Mao Zedong. Nurmi Zohari, the founder of the MNLF, was said to have ideological affinity to Jose Maria Sison, who was the leader of the Communist Party of the Philippines. And even though Islam was part of, the formula for resistance, it was mostly a classic ethno-nationalist liberation movement.
Okay. The struggle or resistance movements eventually fractured when Hashim Salamat separated from the MNLF to form the MILF, Mindanao Islamic Liberation Front, in the late 1970s. When we look at the historically speaking, was this split merely a leadership dispute between these two people, Nur Musyari or Salamat Hashim, or did it mark a fundamental geopolitical shift from Nur Musyari's secular nationalist agenda to a movement more deeply aligned with the global Islamic revivalism at that area?
Well, yeah, that's of course a very important question as well. Also considering that we had later on splits within the Moro movement as well. I think different factors also fed into this divide ultimately. For one, it was about personalities and leadership. As with many rebel groups, at some point, it will be hard to stay together in power once, certain tendencies come out. Part of that was definitely rooted in ideological views. Salamat studied in Cairo at the Al Azhar University. He was also living later in Pakistan, and him and many of his comrades were influenced by Islamic revivalism and Islamist thought, the readings of Sayyid Qutb, of course, and many other, prominent thinkers from that era. But also, part of the equation has been that Salamat and many of his supporters came from central Mindanao, Maguindanao in particular, as well as Lanao, whilst Mizoari and the MNLF rebellion was also strongly rooted on the island of Sulu, where the MNLF also was born, even though the movement quickly spread in other parts of Bangsamoro as well. So Mizori was a secular nationalist who also had a strong Islamic faith, but ultimately it was an ethno-nationalist movement, while Salamat emphasized also religious aspects of the struggle. But I think apart from that, you also had very fundamental questions about, the relationship with the state. And once the MNLF signed the peace agreement with the Marcos government in 1976, the MILF was not convinced by that. So Salamat himself said, "We're not sure about these negotiations. We need to see where it will go." And obviously, the 1976 peace agreement was not very fulfilling. The war continued. So I think many rebels were also hesitant to enter this deal with the government, even though many surrendered. And in future, that would have been the pattern. The Philippine government offers something, many cadres accept, but there are parts who basically say, well, we're just being taken for a ride. We don't think that this peace agreement is genuine. So I think these three different factors, the personal, the ideological, but also the procedural, made the split basically very, very likely, so that the Moro movement splintered.
It's very interesting similarities between these two groups and the Palestinians group like Hamas and Fatah group, one of the secular nationalist movement, and on the other hand, Hamas is the Islamic revivalism or strike movement. Now, there is interesting similarity between these two, but maybe it is the legacy of the Cold War is possibility, I think. Okay, just let me ask another question. During the especially 1970s, when we just unpack through the history, this resistance received significant logistical support through the maybe Sabah or other part, and diplomatic backing from interestingly from Libya, Muammar al-Gaddafi. Looking back at the Cold War area geopolitics, was this external assistance driven purely by pan Islamic solidarity, or was the Mindanao conflict effectively utilized by neighboring states as a strategic lever against the Marcos administration in response to the Philippines' claims over, let us say, some neighboring countries?
Yeah. So I think the context of that time is, of course, very, very interesting and fascinating. It's the time of decolonization, or at least it came to a close. It is the time of the Cold War, new ideas, new movements coming up, newly independent states who are not very secure all the time with respect to their borders. So even before the Mindanao Rebellion and also the communist insurgency that happened, we actually had a triangular relationship between Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines at the backdrop of confrontasi, where the Philippine president, Macapagal, and of course the Indonesian president were actually aligned for short term in their views about Malaysia. And added to that, you have basically this primordial claim of the Sulu Sultanate to Borneo, whilst you have Malaysia and Singapore as new states. I think many people in Malaysia initially were, of course, very sympathetic to the plight of the Moro Muslims, and elsewhere in the world, it was also very much the case. So we do know that there were some efforts of, arms support and training, the batches of the Moro revolutionaries that were training outside Mindanao, where, of course, on Malaysian territory. That has also led members of the Philippine military to be very skeptical about their neighbor. First, because of the Sabah claim, but second, because of these efforts to undermine the territorial sovereignty and integrity of a sovereign nation. Ultimately, some people would allege that Kuala Lumpur made sure that Marcos was really busy fighting the insurgents, and in the end, after his failed effort to launch an invasion in Sabah that led to Jabida, he wasn't able to really deal with the Sabah claim properly because he was just fighting the war. And in that sense, I think that really shaped the relationship of both countries, because some members of the military from the Philippines might still be slightly upset with that ancient history. And I think also vice versa, because from the Malaysian perspective, any conflict or instability in Mindanao will lead to refugees and to people who will leave their homes. So for them, Sabah would always be a very, very sensitive issue as well. Now, apart from these regional geopolitics, you did have the efforts of pan Islamic solidarity, but even Gaddafi was ultimately a power player because he wanted to project leadership within the Islamic world. I think he also wanted to promote his views of anti colonialism, of Islamic causes. He tried to be very prominent at the Organization of Islamic Conference. And I think he just wanted to show to the world that he takes care of people who are oppressed. So, within the context of Southeast Asia, we also know that Libya trained members of the GAM from Aceh in military camps. And we have this link to Libya for the MNLF until the 80s, even as well. I think you can even say there was another country that was important, namely Pakistan, that hosted many Muslim leaders and intellectuals, future leaders of the MILF, that also influenced how Salamat was thinking. So I think the regional and the geopolitical really intertwined and intersected at the backdrop of a time where, so many things were ultimately changing in the world. And I think the legacy of some of these things until now is visible in the peace process as well as in the region more broadly.
And I think, Georgie, if we shed the light under the complex geopolitics and the dynamics of the Cold War, then it's possible to say the case of Mindanao internationalized that time more than regional issues, because on one hand we are talking about the pan-Islamism, its connection with the Islamic Organization cooperation with Muammar Gaddafi. Interesting, you didn't mention Afghanistan, and even some reports I think suggested that the North Korean relations with the region.
Yeah, I mean, I think with respect to North Korea, it was probably rooted, to the best of my knowledge, in in the other conflict with respect to the communist theater, of course. With respect to the MNLF, I heard somewhere, but I only heard this information once, that a few cadres were also in Beijing at some point. But this is a very obscure reference that I don't think has been referenced somewhere in the literature. But you're right. I mean, ultimately, the OIC served as the institution through which the more Muslims tried to articulate their grievances, also through the vehicle of Gaddafi. With respect to Afghanistan, I mean, the Afghan Pakistan border, of course, was very relevant and people were training there. But for example, if we talk about leaders of future Moro groups that were allegedly based in Afghanistan, I think we still lack a lot of written documentation and proof about that. Because for now, especially after 9/11, you always had very prominent narratives that would claim that some of these freedom fighters, especially later on in the 90s, had already links established to organizations such as Al Qaeda and so forth. And I think some of these claims obviously are perhaps slightly exaggerated. Some of them need to be further substantiated. But I think during the era of the 70s and the 80s, we still basically had the classic Cold War actors that were the most relevant there. And I think the interesting thing about the conflict was as well that not only the leaders and the rebels were fighting the war, but you also had Muslim scholars and intellectuals appealing to the world from basically an anti colonial perspective, but also through Gaddafi and other supporters through the Muslim perspective. And I think in that sense, many of these states also had a dilemma, especially Muslim states, because on the one hand, they had to work with their brothers in Islam, but on the other hand, they were still anti government forces. And I think, again, coming back to Confrontasi, when Macapagal met the Indonesian president, they were also exchanging views on how to keep the situation stable, because any government or any military around that time would also be interested in avoiding spillover effects to other countries, which I think in this context makes Indonesia a very interesting partner of the Philippines, or a country, because it was less affected by the conflict directly than Malaysia. And Indonesia was, in fact, the first mediator that managed to, you know, co-facilitate the 1996 peace agreement between the government and the MNLF. Otherwise, the Malaysians were always in a situation of sympathy, commitment, and support. And later on, they facilitated the MILF peace agreement. But at the same time, the perceptions and misperceptions between Manila and Kuala Lumpur still continued to exist.
And the organization of the Islamic operations historically granted the MNLF permanent observer status as the sole representative of the Bangsamoro people. So, given that the later MILF now leads the transitional government, how does this legacy of international recognition complicate the current diplomatic landscape between the Bangsamoro government and the Muslim world?
Well, I think it gets complicated once people want to make it complicated, because, of course, the OIC is an important forum and the MILF itself refers to it. And we know that the MNLF has observer status there. But ultimately, I think it is not so much of a problem, because even at first, parts of the MNLF recognized that the 2012 and 2014 peace agreements encompass many provisions of the 1996 final peace agreement between the government and the MNLF. Later on, we had parts of the MNLF that were brought into this new interim government. And finally, even the group of Nurmi entered that parliament and has their own lieutenants and leaders in that entity. So now all the Moro groups are actually the major ones, the major political military organizations, are all represented in the BTA, so that I believe the MNLF has no incentive to exclusively portray itself as the legitimate Moro movement, despite the fact that, of course, they are represented at the OIC. Because for all intents and purposes, practical cooperation with the MILF and the Bangsamoro more broadly doesn't happen anymore only under the OIC umbrella. You have many Muslim countries that are extending support. Turkey is just one of them. Then you have, of course, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, but also some others. So I think, especially in the run up to the peace agreement and the Bangsamoro region, the OIC also tried to bridge the two groups, and it contributed to a certain semblance of unity between the MN and the MI. And on the ground in the Philippines, in the Bangsamoro, the BTA is basically the institution where all these different wings are represented. The MNLF is still, not very cohesive and coherent. There are different factions of that group. Nurmi is still alive, but I think people realize that beyond the OIC and the Cold War, everybody also needs to be pragmatic there.
The Supreme Court recently ruled to exclude the province of Sulu from Bangsamoro Autonomous Region and postponed the parliamentary elections to 2026. Does this legal exclusion of the Tausung people, who were historically the maritime warriors of the Sulu Sultanate, and fundamentally undermine the concept of unified Bangsamoro identity?
Yeah, that's a great and complex question. I mean, apart perhaps from Palestine that you mentioned, looking at this context also reminds you perhaps of the Horn of Africa, Somalia, or Afghanistan, where you have groups or a group that is united by religion, but that had really, divisions from within. Now, I think when the rebellion started, every Moro was sometimes considered as an enemy of the state by parts of the military during the martial law. That was driving the grievances. Everybody was united in resistance, in faith, and even though some Moro leaders were actually with the government, because for some reasons they still felt loyal to Marcos and the Philippine state, you have of course a contagion where many young men joined up to rebel. But I think after the split, it became evident that these ethno-linguistic communities have their own history. And I think in Bangsamoro history, historically, the Sulu Sultanate and the Maguindanao Sultanate from, Cotabato and Buayan used to be the two major powers who dominated in the maritime domain, who engaged in commerce and trade with the Europeans. You then had also the genesis of a confederation of Muslim principalities or units in the area of northwestern Mindanao, in the Lanao region. And then every of these units starts to develop their own political culture and tradition. So ultimately, if we go by the book, the Moros are 13 ethno-linguistic groups that are united by Islam. Now, whether they consider themselves first Muslims or Moros or their own ethno-linguistic group is, I think, subject to, you know, to the person whom will ask this question. I think there are certain dynamics between all these communities, but when the peace agreement was drafted and concluded, I think people were happy with Bangsamoro identity. But of course, you have, especially in Sulu, some people who would argue, but our identity is slightly different. We're not Bangsamoro, we're Bangsa Sug. And I think the Supreme Court essentially further underlined that this friction exists. 2013, 2014, this friction was, if not hidden, it was managed. In the end, all these communities had to vote whether they want to belong to Bangsamoro. Sulu was very skeptical about it. But you can also unpack this question and ask, if you really go down to that island and you ask everybody, I would still say there are many who would consider themselves Bangsamoro. I mean, they're relatives of the first rebels from Sulu. I think they would also consider themselves as Moro. But then you have those whose sentiments are slightly different. And I think that makes this whole identity question so diverse and unique. Part of the Aminalef rebellion also occurred at the southern part of Palawan, which is why we sometimes hear about the Bangsamoro homeland being Minsupala, Mindanao, Sulu, Palawan. But when I visited actually southern Palawan, Balabac, and Bataraza more than 10 years ago, 2014, people were telling me they're Filipino Muslims because time has passed from the fighting in the 70s until now, and memory and historical consciousness also changed. That did not happen in other parts of the southern Philippines. So I think it's a very complex questions. Of course, it undermines the concept ultimately, going back at your question. But I think identities are also very dynamic. They can be reinvented, they can be renegotiated, and perhaps the last word on Sulu has also not been spoken. So maybe it will be very interesting to see what will be the developments in the next months or even years.
And with the parliamentary election pushed to the 2026 this year, do you see that extension provide the necessary time to resolve the redistricting issues caused by Zulus exist, or does it risk creating a constitutional crisis where the transitional authority mandate is perceived or as overextended without a fresh electoral mandate? What will be solution or the path road?
Yeah, I mean, this is also very, I mean, to an extent, it's a very Bangsamoro question, but it also mirrors some issues in the Philippines more broadly. I mean, first, the elections are always a bit of a paradox because, for the better or for the worse, the Philippines inherited a certain type of democratic electoral tradition from the United States elections are a part of the Philippines and Bangsamoro, but at the same time, it is also a very different political culture than from the US or from other Western countries. When we speak about democracy in BARMM or in Mindanao, you often hear the local joke, it's actually democracy. And I think it's because, for example, the most peaceful towns during elections are those where you don't have contest, where you have one candidate and everybody agrees on him or her, and that's it. But where four people will fight for the position of a mayor, that's where violence can really increase. And I have seen it throughout my time also when I was living in Maguindanao and also observing from from that vantage point. So I think first things first, conceptually speaking, elections are a double edged sword in any case. People know that. And more importantly, the elites know that. Hence, they know what strings to pull and what to communicate to the people. And I think right now, the election debate evolves also around the question of, is this really the climax and the high point of the political track of the peace process? The peace agreement says it. Everybody after 2014 and 2019 was saying it. But seemingly, there are no major protests against these extensions. You have many lawmakers and many elites who are seemingly okay with extending it even more. And of course, oftentimes those who defend the postponement are themselves beneficiaries from that. But at the same time, as long as most of the elites are in unison about this, if that's the way forward, then it will be hard for people to resist because they have already been used to a certain type of political culture where they can vote freely, but oftentimes this vote is also influenced by other factors. So I think the current debate is maybe less so much about constitutional crisis, but it also feeds into the general delays related to the peace process, the friction within the MILF because of the changes in leadership that the Philippine government has undertaken last year, and basically the question of where do we position ourselves. So I think if the elections go ahead, there can be, things that go wrong. If the elections are postponed to 2028, then many things can once again happen in the next 2.5 years. I think the redistricting ultimately is an important issue, but a key observation I think we have in Bangsamoro is many things appear to be very legal or judicial, but ultimately it's about politics. It's about power, and the judicial language may often be the first level that we talk about these things. But behind everything is, of course, the barrel of the gun and the importance of, control and influence.
And recent data, Georgia, from the Bangsamoro Board of Investments indicates that the region secured billions in investments in 2025 in the Filipino pesos. So, however, analysts often question the source of this capital. Are we seeing a genuine foreign direct investment entering the region, or are these figures dominated by the local government or the clans to spending on the domestic expansion?
Yeah, I mean that is really the promise of the peace agreement, right? That the Bangsamoro will become a peaceful and prosperous region. I think zooming out from the investments, it's just one side of the economic landscape because you also have other indicators such as poverty incidence, where BARMM is still one of the poorest regions in the country, but at the same time, officially, you did have a reduction of poverty compared with the past. You have economic production and economic growth and revenue generation as well, but it should be contrasted with some other health indicators, for example, or education levels. So that suggests already it's a very double edged sword. With respect to investments, I think, of course, it's part of the region's job to promote the region. So you need to say we're open for investment everybody's welcome. And we did have some positive news. I mean, we hear mostly about crops. You have, for example, the coconut industry that tried to expand in parts of central Mindanao. You have processing of, for example, abaca, which is a material also indigenous to Mindanao and other places. You also have, especially these agribusiness investments and a lot of announcements and talks. But I think ultimately it's not much. And foreign investments, in my view, we still don't see enough of them. And it's not a surprise because any investor would want to have absolute certainty and minimization of risk. And in the case of Bangsamoro, it's still in pockets unstable. If I want to come in, what is the guarantee that I can promote my business, that I will not be extorted, that no violence will displace my workers, and things like that? And in addition to that, you already have a political economy that remains dominated by key political economic operators. You have also the influence of the government and the bureaucracy and the state, but you have the lack of a middle class. After all, most of the members of the MILF are still fishermen and farmers. Many residents of Maguindanao and Lanao del Sur are basically earning their wages through that type of work. And I think ultimately, even if a plantation comes and hires a bunch of people, it might not be enough. So the private sector development within BARMM, the economic growth of that region, is really something. I wouldn't call it a blind spot, but this is really where we see challenges. We have a lot of attorneys and engineers running the bureaucracy, but I haven't seen many economists because ultimately that is also what is needed. And many families, if their kids and relatives are now working for the Bangsamoro government, that's essentially fair enough. It's employment guaranteed by the state or by the region, but you don't have per se uh, big businesses that are now developing the local economy. You have semblances of that in the cities. So in Cotabato City, we've seen more and more signs of small investments, gastronomy. People have coffee shops and all of that. You have a mall that is there. But in rural areas, it would really depend. Once you go to the to the center of a town, you see new things, new stores, which is good. But once you go down to the villages, I think there we see the different side of development where the peace dividends do not trickle down. Of course, you can say it will take time to achieve a more, sophisticated level. I mean, even in Aceh, their progress has not been absolutely stellar. But I think ultimately the question is can be more done, and I think the answer is definitely yes. But for that, the Bangsamoro government also needs to do more specifically vis-a-vis the economy. And just to give you one final example, what I found very interesting, when the region was starting out, there was a clear order that, for example, if people travel to other parts of Mindanao and if they organize trainings and events, ideally it should all stay within the Bangsamoro, right? So that local businesses are empowered, local restaurants can cater. But unfortunately, it became more and more the type of aircon seminar mentality where people go to Davao, to Manila to conduct their activities there, to have meetings there, to spend a lot of money that is being also given for the Bangsamoro development. But ultimately, it stays often outside, not inside. And I think there you can, of course, ask the question, why is that? And can we really change that? That's more of a philosophical question, but I think that is really one of the key issues right now in the peace implementation.
And Georgie, since our topic about the economy and the developments of the region, in addition to the promotion of the BARM and the agriculture of the tourism, Would you have any comment about the petrol reserve in the region or the port, and what is the gates of the region to open the outside of the world, especially bringing new investments? What is another options, especially for international investments or for the region's
Yeah,
authority?
I mean, I definitely believe in. I mean, the Philippines is an archipelago, and I think it has been trying to become more archipelagic geopolitically, but also geo-economically, even though it's not very easy. Best example is it's not that easy to commute between different islands, even outside of Mindanao. Now, there are signs that ports are being strengthened and built up, but even, for example, in BARMM, we have seen a paradox, and also other coastal towns of Mindanao. You have the emergence, for example, of private wharfs, where the elites and the political power brokers are using them for their own business activities, which is good for them. But the question is, does this trade also trickle down to other parts of the community? I think in some cases the answer is yes, in others, not so much. So when it comes to investments, I think from the foreign perspective, there's also, apart from the fact that it might still be not fully stable, there are issues about infrastructure and simply the opportunity to do certain type of business in an area that is still very much lagging behind. So the Bangsamoro has an department or an entity to plan in that regard, but I think, like with some other ministries right now, revolutionaries who turned governors are struggling. It's not always easy to deliver on what they initially hope to do. And I think when it comes to its geography, everything comes and falls with the geographic equation of political power. So economic development in Lanao and Maguindanao might be slightly different from the island provinces. And that's where we have the connection to the geostrategic defense aspects as well. Because Basilan, Sulu, and Tawi-Tawi historically have played a key role in this maritime corridor. They have had a thriving, island community and industry, but you have decades of war that influenced that. Sulu is now, after the conflict with the MNLF subsided, and after the Abu Sayyaf group became more and more irrelevant, is now reaping the harvest of peace in a way. But development is still relatively small scale, because for now no one is really coming in and making a big bet on that island. And one of the reasons is also that it's being ruled by a very savvy political kingpin who also wants to steer Sulu in accordance with his views on development. So these big men of politics that Southeast Asian literature talks about are still very, very relevant at this point in time. And I think to break certain deadlock needs to happen gradually. And perhaps a good hope would be the next generation of political leaders who have been educated abroad or in Manila, in Malaysia, and who might have, good ideas. With respect to resources, I mean, Mindanao is very rich. BARM has produced a lot of fish, for example, according to statistics. But ultimately, it doesn't always go back to the communities and the people, and it's not very sustainable. So I would probably say the maritime aspect is really, really important, but even there you have the politics that are coming in and making it really difficult. We've heard about joint British Australian oil and gas exploration somewhere in the Sulu Sea, but even that we still need to wait how that will go. What will happen in central Mindanao in the Ligawasan Marsh? We've been hearing a lot about, again, oil and gas reserves, but ultimately the process is very slow in really figuring out, well, how much is there and how do we even start this process, even though they're first steps to unlock the potential.
And just come back to the Sulu issues. The exclusion of Sulu not only removes a political consistency, but will also strips the Bangsamoro region of its direct maritime border with Malaysia, Indonesia, and strategically speaking, how can the region realistically position itself as the trade gateway to the ASEAN market when it has effectively lost its control over the critical shipping lanes of the Sulu Sea?
Yeah, well, again, BARM might be disadvantaged in the short term. Of course, Sulu might benefit and the Philippines writ large. But I think looking at Mindanao as a whole, you don't only have that western portion. You also have the south of Mindanao, General Santos City, Sarangani province. If you go south from that area, you will already reach at some point Sulawesi. So that's another linkage that is very interesting and where potentially connections can be made, which was ideally originally the whole vision of the 1990s and the BIMP EAGA economic area that people hoped would ultimately develop. I think apart from Sulu, you have Tawi Tawi, which is an island province that is very much near to Malaysia, right? The Turtle Islands are the most, I think, the furthest island areas of the Philippines as a whole. So Tawi Tawi offers a lot of potential, particularly for tourism and small scale trade and other cross border movements, sea traffic, and so forth. But ultimately, again, development takes time. And I think the ports in Bongao, the capital, and maybe even in Sulu and in Basilan, the other island province, they all need more upgrades and more development. I think for now, you know, certain advantages of these maritime provinces are, the seaweed industry, for example, where Tawi Tawi played a huge role. Unfortunately, it has been also severely affected, negatively speaking, in the last years. Um, we also talk a lot about, halal products and that opportunity. But for me, I see it from a distance, but you sometimes don't see the substantial results on the ground, which also raised the question, maybe we need more time and a more economically viable way of thinking. Because ultimately, if we want local elites to play a key role in development, you need to also offer them some carrots. And right now, in the regional arrangement in the Bangsamoro, Sulu is already out. The other islands have their own agenda. You would also need to have strong leadership from the Philippine national government to really focus on this periphery and have strategic investment. And unfortunately, I also don't see it a lot, as well as the attention to the peace process more broadly, because as you probably know, the current Marcos government is now not as strong as it used to be. It faces a lot of domestic controversies, and traditionally, Manila has always been focused on its immediate environment. Mindanao has been at the edge, and I think this promising peace process that should unfold even more is a little bit lagging behind. And naturally, economic development and economic thinking, unfortunately, is also affected by this.
Georgia, economically thinking the geopolitics of the region, do you think that will there be any effects or implications of Indonesia's moving its capital from the Jakarta to the Borneo, little bit close to the Manila?
I think the same question was asked to the Malaysian defense secretary during Shangri-La last year, I think. And he basically joked and said, well, not really, but maybe it can also play a positive role in terms of jobs and so forth. I think for now, we will not see a lot of impact of that, also because we're not really sure if this move of the capital will actually really take place. For me, the other interesting question is, will the like how does China come in all of that? First, you have PLA ships and vessels who are also in the proximity of Sulu, Basilan, and Tawi Tawi. Once in a while, you have sightings of these these ships. And from the Philippine side, you cannot do much but just realize that this is maybe more and more happening a reality. You cannot deter them per se. um, some people would look at China as a potential positive player. Like if you say, hey, they can come into Mindanao and also invest and do positive things. Now, we had that opportunity for the whole country during the presidency of Duterte. I think the consensus is didn't work out as expected. So right now, is there motivation to invest in ports and other centers from the Chinese side? With the current Philippine government, doesn't look like that. And again, there are other donors and economic players that are trying to play their part. And here you have to name Japan. What is more, what is also interesting is looking at this region. The Philippines has a certain position geopolitically speaking, but how will this oil exploration around the Sulu Sea work out? How will the PLA presence near southwestern Mindanao continue? Will there be at some point a friction? Because again, if you look at the Philippines from a great power perspective, and if you're China, some people have been saying, okay, isn't there a reason for them to try to indirectly influence Mindanao in order to make the Philippines even more distracted than it already is? I think this is still more of a fear than a reality, but I think BARMM and Mindanao remain, critical parts of the geopolitical equation of the Philippines. And I think any weakness or instability in that part will, of course, benefit people and institutions and countries that would like to see the Philippines continue to be preoccupied. And how to counter that on an economic level is very hard to say, because ultimately it's not only Bangsamoro that we talk about, but also Mindanao Island as a whole, where you have currently a very unpopular Philippine president, where people still sympathize with the clan of former President Duterte. But it doesn't really change the big picture of foreign investments or of foreign, economic efforts to uplift communities down south. So it's all very, very fluid. And I think many factors influence this part of Southeast Asia, but we don't have yet a clear trajectory where everything will ultimately go.
And Joe, just open a small parenthesis. Is it possible to say, or based on your observation, is there any differences in China's approach to the Manina's central government and Mindanao's BARM's regional autonomous regions in terms of the economical approach? I mean, given the
I think there
frictions
were
between Manila and Beijing's.
Well, I think initially there was, of course, an effort to come in, especially 2016 onwards. But even in Mindanao, we have not seen a lot. Like, I remember one example that people have been usually doing. China funded the drug rehabilitation center in northern Mindanao, and it was promoted as part of the BRI. In terms of substantial work, in that part, it didn't happen. And I think it didn't happen because the Philippines had already Japan that really supported a lot of development work in this region. And I think there was simply no incentives for people to explicitly call China for investments. Not to mention that across the country, China struggled to win the hearts and minds of the people because of the issues in the South China Sea, but also they tried to be present in key strategic areas of the country where the military, even under Duterte, was communicating to the president, you cannot give Beijing an opening here because ultimately it will be to our detriment. So right now, I think China would not even care so much about um, economic development in the Bangsamoro because the incentive to do so is very, very low. China is doing what it does at sea. It tries to have a general economic relationship with the Philippines and vice versa. But I think BRI, also regionally and globally speaking, has also slowed down a little bit and the geoeconomic landscape in the world also changed. Ironically, the United States, I think, is maybe not too dissimilar because, for the longest time, people were hoping that the Trump administration and, of course, Biden before that would be an economic partner of the Philippines too, beyond security. And in some ways, it worked. But now we see with Trump 2.0 that things are also very different with the tariffs and other aspects. And even if investment will be given as promised and discussed in some of the meetings between Marcos and members of the administration, I think Mindanao is just not that much affected by it because development aid from other sources is coming in. Now, at some point, it will be reduced without question. If you look at funding cuts everywhere, the European Union, Australia, they're still supporting the peace process, but I think the flow of money at some point will also change. And interestingly, we can now ask, is this now the chance for other players? What about Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, Turkey? Can these countries do their small bits in order
Filling the
to
gap.
help? Exactly, whether strategic or not. I think for now it's a bit hard to say, but I think it would be welcome if Philippines neighbors will try to work with opportunities that they can see in the Bangsamoro. But even talking to friends from Malaysia, I think here you have security aspects. Even though you're from a relatively similar culture, ultimately, Bangsamoro remains a region where, in parts, you still have a lot of armed actors. You still have a lot of uncertainty. You have political instability, and it doesn't give confidence to investors to go all in. That's why, for now, I think we see small interventions, scholarships, donations, some initial conversations that often don't go beyond a certain point. But perhaps it would change. And I think it might also be welcome for the people of BARMM because, in the end, we're at a time where every country should assert their autonomy, try to do the best it can with respect to cooperation with like minded or pragmatic partners. Because if we see this current turmoil globally affecting middle sized countries, if you don't work with people who are with countries who are like you might be pushed aside by the big powers. So I think it would be in the interest of many players in Southeast Asia to walk the talk about ASEAN, to walk the talk about, you know, implementing certain economic cooperation activities beyond just cosmetic statements. But unfortunately, we're not yet at this point because many countries still distrust each other for historical reasons. And even within ASEAN, you have now a war that broke out and where we don't know what the year will bring to Thai Cambodia as well. So I think it's only in the interest of Malaysia that BARMM will be stable and productive. Same for the Philippines. But ironically, both can do more to properly, I think, guide this region towards a more systematic way forward.
And come back to our initial topics. We are talking about our regions, how combatants and struggle background and building institutions and everything is, difficult to transit from one process to another. And I want to ask, the decommissioning of the combatants is a central pillar of the comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro. But with the political uncertainty surrounding the Sulu ruling, is there intelligence suggesting that disillusioned fighters might migrate towards spoiler groups like the BIFF who rejects the peace process?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. I think, first of all, for now, most of the Bangsamoro leaders of these political military groups are um, accommodated in the political arrangement. Many commanders of the MILF have received benefits one way or another. You have, of course, some who missed out a little bit, but ultimately, broadly speaking, the peace holds. Now, is the crisis that severe that young men who are part of the MILF or civilians would pick up um, arms again to fight? I'm not so sure because, first, who do you join? The MILF has clearly said we accept the path forward for peace. The splinter groups of the MILF that are outside the peace process are at their weakest right now. The BIFF and the Dawla Islamiyah, the Maute that played a key part in the Marawi conflict 2017, the Abu Sayyaf, all of that is really different to 5 years ago. So if you're frustrated and angry, who do you go to? And I think these groups also don't have a clear message because ultimately the MILF would say, we got autonomy. And I think when we have people who are frustrated with the way how the peace process is going, they would also say, well, maybe our fathers, uncles, brothers have committed blunders, but it will only get better. Like we already have a minimum state of peace. Again, we shouldn't go back to war. But in the long run, if, health, education, economic performance, marginalization will remain key elements of Bangsamoro political life, then it might be just a matter of time until a message and a messenger will emerge and say, okay, we need to go back to the struggle. It might take 6 months, it might take 6 years, but in an ecosystem that has seen so many cycles of conflict, this is obviously a very complex and organic development. And I think the government really needs to make sure that it tries to comply with the agreement where it committed itself to certain things. If parts of the Moro class will feel they're being left outside, or young people where they feel that both their traditional leaders and the revolutionaries have betrayed them, then I think there's always the possibility that someone would emerge and say, okay, guys, we need to do another round because we have not harvested the fruits of peace. Only others did that, not us. So that's why I think it's very important that Manila, but also the Bangsamoro government, do their part. Because if this peace process fails, then in this current global climate, I don't think we would need another organized violence in Mindanao.
Yes, it will be benefit of both parties to keeping the
Yeah.
peace process. And when the first regular parliament finally convenes in 2026, the region will transition from a revolutionary government to a standard bureaucracy. But when we historically look at liberation movements often struggle with this shift. So what safeguards are in place to ensure the new government doesn't simply replicate the traditional clan-based politics that have plagued Mindanao for decades?
So actually, we have this transition already, right? Since 2019, we have former rebels being now bureaucrats. And I think we already see the limitations. We've seen issues with respect to inclusion, power sharing, skills. Some Bangsamoro ministries are doing well, others not so much. And I think looking at this process, there are different views. There are those who believe that the revolutionaries fell into a trap and committed many blunders and became the devil they despised. But then you have also those who would argue they're trying their best. You can't expect everything from them, but the political families have been the ones who've been sabotaging the whole thing in the first place. I would argue the truth is obviously somewhere in the middle. The MI left tries to, in some ways, their best, but they're struggling. And I think no one should have had illusions about the ability of former rebels to magically become the best administrators in the world. The MILF received a lot of support, that is true, technical assistance, capacity building, but perhaps the lesson here is that some of that should also be fine tuned or tweaked or adjusted. And likewise, you have some clans who are also trying to do their best, who are skilled, who are well educated, and who do envision, a more broader understanding of governance. But you also have those who basically look at it from a zero-sum game perspective. The current chief minister of the BARMM is the chief of staff of the MILF, but he enjoys the support from many of these political families. Now, some of the revolutionaries now look at him from a very skeptical perspective. But ultimately speaking, objectively, well, maybe to an extent, you do need to have someone like that. But the way how that situation was reached through changing political power, intervening from the side of Manila, was not very helpful. And at the same time, the MILF also tried to be more ambitious than it probably should have with respect to local politics. They were trying to battle the clans as early as 2019, 2020, but from their perspective, they were forced into that position in the first place. So it becomes a chicken and the egg situation. And I think this dilemma is not new for the MILF. You heard these statements from Trotsky, from Ho Chi Minh. The latest would be Ahmed al-Shara in Syria, who is grappling with transforming society from the war to peace mode. And I think in the Philippines, specifically in Bangsamoro, this is ultimately the key question. Will these tensions in the post-conflict stage be managed? And will we see accommodation and gradual development? Or do we risk more flare ups and local grievances, local instability that will really cast a shadow on the whole Bangsamoro project? Because then, in the worst case, will be 5 years, nothing will happen, everything will be fine, and all of a sudden, you will have another Marawi or another group. I think no one really wants that, which makes it even more important to tackle the root causes of underdevelopment, marginalization, and of course, autonomy and keeping everybody in the political picture. Because if someone feels excluded, that's often the very first step for disaster.
Thank you very much, Georgie, for sharing your rich experience with us about the one of the most important geopolitical point and region in Southeast Asia.
Thank you, Lokman.
And this is a really important region, and I hope the both side, Manila and Bangsamoro authorities, will keep the peace forward. The geographically is an important and I think also beautiful region in terms of the tourism and just next to the sea with its beach, and it must be very nice region. Why not to make a good peace between these two nations, Filipinos and Bangsamoro region? And I hope it will be the economic hub, maybe touristic hub, educational hub. And your experience is
Yeah.
really rich. I appreciate this is coming through the years. I think not this short time. And thank you very much again, Georgie, for sparing your time and sharing your insight with my audiences.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. And also thank you for my audiences. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. We have a massive of line of episodes that are upcoming about the critical point geopolitical developments about around the world. Please subscribe and hit the notification bell, and waiting for our next episode. And see you on Tuesday. On yes, next Tuesday we will have another episode.